Well, let me ask you this question. Have you ever felt spiritually exhausted? Have you ever felt Christian exhausted? And I don't mean from a connection with God or Christ, but from a faith system that no longer makes sense, that deep down soul weary feeling like you've been faith sleepwalking, very disconnected from it, maybe questioning the whole point of spirituality or Christianity. Now, I realize some of us right now watching this, you're in the middle of that kind of exhaustion, while there are others of you who have moved beyond that. But no matter where you are in this journey, we all need a spirituality that feels alive, one that doesn't drain us, but fills us, where God is fully present, where we experience freedom. The decline of Christian spirituality is all around us. There is Christian fatigue everywhere. Church attendance has dropped nearly 30% in 2 decades. And 29% of U.S. adults now consider themselves unaffiliated. That is a 16% rise in just the last decade. But here's the deal. People aren't abandoning their Christian spirituality. They're wanting to reimagine it. And so there's many seeking a spirituality that's rooted in love and wisdom and compassion, in inclusion instead of the fear and then excluding. And Spero Dei, we are on the forefront of shaping that. And there are also more and more faith communities rising up, daring to embody something new, something that breathes, something that evolves. So it's not just about a decline. There is actually an awakening happening. And if you are part of this shift, this thing that's happening, you are kind of like a pioneer. You're part of it. And so, because there is a type of Christianity that no longer resonates, biblical literalism, rigid doctrines, where there's no room for intellect or curiosity, heck, even common sense. And so loving people who actually have a sincere spiritual heart that want to attach to Christ, they are looking for a different kind of Christian spirituality. They're looking for something deeper, something wider. In fact, just this past week, 2 pastors came up to me who are in these rigid communities. They themselves are committed to their Christian spirituality, but there is this whispering saying, help. And they don't want to walk away. They actually want to walk forward. But they serve in these spaces where change is seen as a betrayal, where honest questions just feel too dangerous. And so they are experiencing and sensing that God's love is bigger than this. And that's where they're wanting to move. But man, if they do in their communities, they risk losing friends, family, their careers, financial security. I know such a thing full well. And this vacancy that we're seeing in church and in Christendom, this vacancy is also happening in other places of our culture. There are observers that go, we are experiencing a crisis of meaning. John Vervaeke, who talks a lot about this, talks about our collapse to connection, to purpose. Scott Galloway points out that men in particular are suffering from this loneliness that's happening, this crisis of meaning. Jonathan Haidt also warns that younger generations, specifically men, are vulnerable to nihilism, addiction, radicalization. And, I think this is partly why we are seeing the rise of people like Joe Rogan or even Jordan Peterson. It's not my cup of tea, but they are providing these structures, even if they're not always healthy. I actually think the way is forward, not backward. It's deeper. It's more expansive. It's not reclaiming something lost in the past, this lost sense of meaning. I think it's moving towards something new that holds wisdom and mystery, actually a greater love, a greater kind of spirituality. And even in our Christian tradition, if you go all the way back to the stories of Jesus, he moved it forward right in front of them. He was moving rigid religious frameworks forward by reimagining them, reclaiming them in a sense. So here's a scene out of Jesus's life. Let me tell you this. Jesus has just begun his ministry and his teaching is spreading. Crowds are gathering and they are drawn to this rabbi who speaks with this unsettling wisdom and love. And he stands on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee. And there he is with people who are long been told, here's how you follow God, by their religious leaders, people who have built this system that's meant to preserve holiness and guard the Bible doctrines. But over time, by the time Jesus gets there, it's just become suffocating. Many feel unseen, unworthy. And then Jesus shows up and he literally moves the whole thing forward. Look at this in Matthew 5. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here to be salt seasoning that brings out the God flavors of this earth. If you lose your saltiness, how will people ever taste the richness of God's presence? You've lost your usefulness and you'll end up in the garbage. Here's another way to put it. You're here to be light, bringing out the God colors in the world. God isn't meant to be hidden or kept secret. So like a city on a hill, your faith is meant to shine. If I've made you light bearers, I'm not going to hide you under a bucket. I'm setting you high on a stand so you can be seen. Now that you're there, shine. Live with openness, generosity, and love. And when you open your life to others, you create space for them to open their hearts to God, our generous Father in heaven. Don't suppose for a minute that I have come to demolish the Scriptures, either God's law or the prophets. I'm not here to demolish, but to complete. I'm going to put it all together, pull it all together in a vast panorama. God's law is more real and lasting than the stars in the sky and the ground at your feet. Long after the stars burn out and earth wears out, God's law will be alive and working. Trivialize even the smallest item in God's law, and you will only have trivialized yourself. But take it seriously. Show the way for others, and you'll find honor in the kingdom. Unless you do far better than the religious leaders in the matters of right living, you won't know the first thing about entering the kingdom. Well, so there's no doubt when it comes to this verse, many people have been taught that here Jesus is reinforcing a strict law, keeping, you got to keep it, like many of you have experienced. But there's others deeply rooted in the Scriptures that actually see something richer here. This is Christ moving the faith forward into openness, generosity, and wholeness. And, most credible scholars agree that Matthew was written around 80 to 90 CE and addressing Christians who are wrestling with how to integrate their historic faith with new spiritual insights. So Jesus isn't merely repeating old religious laws, he's evolving them in real time, what spirituality needs to be. And so Christ speaks directly to their spiritual exhaustion. Look at this in verse 17. Don't suppose for a minute that I've come to demolish the scriptures, either God's law or the prophets. I'm not here to demolish, but to complete. I'm going to put it all together, pull it all together in a vast panorama. I just love this because Jesus isn't here to reinforce what has already been. He's moving the faith forward. He's taking the scriptures, expanding it right before their eyes. Now, he doesn't discard the past, which is important. He's actually fulfilling it, unlocking its deeper purpose, shifting the focus from rigid law keeping to a dynamic, living relationship with God. And so when you think of every parable, every ministry act he does, every challenge to religious authority, in his way, he's showing that faith isn't about preserving something that was, but it's stepping into what it's becoming. And so if God is truly vast and infinite, well, then things grow, right? Healthy things grow, they evolve. And so true spirituality isn't about clinging to some certainty as if our faith is fragile. That's what certainty is. It's creating a fragile faith. And that's, not what he's doing. And so the deeper we go, the more rigid answers, they just lose their appeal. And when faith is alive, it doesn't shrink, it expands, it makes room for mystery and discovery, and a kind of knowing that isn't about having all the answers. You don't need to have all the answers, but it's actually being present in the questions. And I'll tell you what, looking back on my faith, when it stopped expanding, I started to suffocate. And so I think here Christ brilliantly offers this metaphor of salt and light, right? Salt preserves what is sacred, but too much of it ruins a dish. Light reveals reality, but if it's misused too bright, it blinds. So Christ isn't telling us to abandon our tradition, but to ensure that it never becomes a prison. That's what he's doing. Now, letting go felt terrifying, right? I remember when I went through this. Letting go is a scary thing. I mean, have you ever clung to something so long, even after it stopped serving you? Research shows that holding on to outdated beliefs, it just increases our anxiety. And when we can let them go, it fosters our well-being. And so Christ is leading them towards a spirituality that breathes and grows. And verse 18, this is what he says. God's law is more real and lasting than the stars in the sky and the ground at your feet. Long after the stars burn out and the earth wears out, God's law will be alive and working. Now, notice what he says here. He says God's law, which is the Mosaic law, it's alive. It's not frozen in time, but it's dynamic. It's unfolding. I don't believe that Christ is calling for a rigid adherence to literalism because he's actively expanding the very tradition his listeners thought was fixed. And so he's moving, as I keep saying, he's moving it forward in real time, right in front of them. It's to become a lived experience. And when you look at the history of Christian spirituality, it tells the same story. Scripture has always been alive. It's always been growing and adapting and expanding across generations. People of faith have wrestled, reimagined, rediscovered deeper truths, not because it's meant to stay fixed, but because it grows and they're finding deeper ways to love and justice and compassion. And the moment, or I should say the movement from the law of the prophets to Christ, even that isn't about rigid decrees. It's about a greater love. So for a moment, let me talk about your mental and existential health with all of this. Neuroscience tells us that meaning, it's essential to your and my well-being. When we are contributing to something greater, our stress decreases, our resilience increases, we flourish. And so Christ, aligning perfectly with this, urges us beyond superficial religious righteousness. Look at this. He shows us this in verses 19 and 20. Trivialize even the smallest item in God's law, and you will only have trivialized yourself. But take it seriously, show the way for others, and you will find honor in the kingdom. Unless you do far better than the religious leaders in matters of right living, you won't know the first thing about entering the kingdom. So here's what I take from this. Christ isn't talking about a fixed moralistic law that's kept static. He's not reducing righteousness to a checklist of religious behaviors that then you kind of enforce by obedience or shame. Shame has never been a true path to transformations. And we all know studies show the same things, right? Shame isolates, it narrows the soul, it doesn't make us whole, it makes us smaller, more fearful. Shame makes us more disconnected. And so the story of God is an unfolding story. Creation is not confined to moral codes. Religion isn't. And so a faith that clings to unchanging legalism, in a moment it may feel safe, but it's actually too small for God, who is still revealing, still calling us to something deeper. Christ isn't inviting us to a system of control. He's calling us to a spirituality that's expansive enough to hold the vastness of all of our human experience, where love is the highest ethic, where awakening is never found in fear, but it's found in presence and connection to God. And so, are we truly connected to our inner selves, or is our faith just this transactional performance? I've been there, masking my exhaustion behind a facade of beliefs and certainty, afraid to admit I have doubts. But when I stopped doing that, here's the deal: I didn't lose my faith. I awakened greater to it. And so our Christian tradition, it's never meant to be abandoned. It's meant to be reimagined. And study after study shows that cultural, religious traditions, they do enhance our well-being. And as author, theologian Brian McLaren writes, tradition must be continually reinvented to remain alive. And so the turning point then is radical. It's moving from a transactional belief system to a living, breathing spirituality. When this shift happens, faith becomes less about transaction. It becomes more authentic. It becomes about a becoming. It's less about proving our spiritual worth and more about recognizing, we're already worthy. God's presence is already with us. So what does this mean for us? Well, if Christ moved the faith forward, evolving it, why can't we ask, what does then that mean for us today? Well, a living spirituality, I think, invites mystery, invites you to grow, to continually become more deeply human and then profoundly connected to the divine. So perhaps today's your turning point. Perhaps it's time to release what's no longer serving your soul and have a different kind of trusting in Christ, who is breathing new life from ancient wisdom. So together we can step into this adventure together, alive, awake, and wherever it leads. So that's what it means. Now, what doesn't it mean? It doesn't mean we have to throw away where we've come from. We don't have to throw away Christianity. Our spiritual heritage still holds wisdom, and we don't have to reject the past in order to move forward. Growth doesn't mean abandoning our traditions or our narratives. It means making them more alive, more real, evolving them so they reflect greater love. It doesn't mean anything goes, nor locking ourselves into rigid rules to protect us, using fear to protect our spirituality. I think a real morality, it's never about absolutes. Real morality always evolves through times. There were certain things we thought back then, but we don't think that anymore. Why? Because human development and understanding who we are, it has us see things differently. It also doesn't mean we have to choose between faith and reason and common sense. Parents, please teach your children this. Some people think, I'm going to have to abandon my intellectual honesty, but the opposite is true. A faith that cannot wrestle with science or history or human experience, well, that's too fragile of a faith to hold up. A mature faith, it's not afraid of knowledge. It's actually deepened by it. And it may change beliefs based on a growing knowledge. So the words that shaped our tradition, they still have power. But they're most powerful when we let them breathe. Faith is not about freezing our scriptures in time. It's reimagining of how they speak now. And again, what it does mean, it means love is the true measure of Christian spirituality. If something leads us into love for God, love for others, love for ourselves, it's actually fulfilling what Christian spirituality was always meant to be. And it means, as I've said, our morality is something that evolves. And when we come to understand love and inclusion and human dignity more fully, our sense of what's right or wrong, that evolves too. And moral absolutes become blind and rigid. And moral relativism can make common sense seem silly. And so the more we tune into God, our faith should expand. It means our faith was never meant to be static. And so if our understanding of God never expands, we might be worshiping our certainty rather than actually God. True faith, right? It adapts, it transforms. And it means a growing wisdom is more important than even ancient doctrines. That is what Jesus is teaching, I think, in these scriptures. He's actually reclaiming them, saying, we hold to them, but he's saying, I think he's evolving them right there. So we don't need to discard tradition to grow. We're just reimagining it. Well, thanks for tuning in, everybody. And I'll be back next week. Peace.